It's the mid-1990s in Baltimore, a city so ravaged by drugs and violence some sections resemble a dystopian movie. It's close to one of those run-down places where a tall 450-pound man named Joe Metheney runs an open-pit pork and beef stand on the weekends. It's so popular that on some afternoons people queue up to be served one of his famous tasty burgers. What they don't know is that a couple of years after they consumed that delicious piece of meat encased between two lightly grilled buns, they'll discover they were eating people. As with many of our serial killer stories, we'll start with childhood, since in most cases, it's during the criminal's formative years where you find clues as to what drove the person to do what they did. The problem with Metheney's story is that there are conflicting reports. Metheney himself said his childhood wasn't a happy one at all. He said his alcoholic father often abandoned the family when he was just a kid, and his mother was hardly ever around because she worked double shifts in an effort to look after her 6 children. His conclusion is that he was neglected. Maybe that's true, maybe it wasn't. When he was eventually arrested for his crimes, he said he hadn't seen any of his brothers or sisters for many years, and both his mom and pop were dead. This wasn't true. His mother was found, and she said, "Maybe he just wishes I was. He pushed his family away a long time ago." She explained how it was true that her son just took off, but his family life wasn't all that bad, and he was an intelligent kid. She denied that he'd ever been in any foster homes, where he actually said he'd passed around plenty of them. What is certain, though, is that he had a homicidal rage that drove him to commit some very heinous crimes, and in his own words, enjoyed it. It's also true that from a young age he spent just about all his time taking drugs, namely heroin and crack cocaine. What led to his addiction, we can't say, but things started to go wrong for him when he was 6. That's when his father crashed his car and died. From then on, his mother worked pretty hard night and day, sometimes as a waitress, sometimes as a barmaid, sometimes as a canteen truck driver. Despite being a very large kid, he was scared of violence and didn't like to fight when prompted to do so. He wasn't a mean kid at all. He was always polite to everybody, his mother later said. He was also bright at school, but instead of pursuing academic success, he joined the army. After serving in Germany, he said he was sent to Vietnam. It's there, he said, he was introduced to heroin, and that's how he got his taste for opioids. Still, there is some doubt if he ever served in Vietnam. What is a nailed-on fact is that in the mid-70s he was already a junkie. That's when he lost all contact with his family. His mother later said, "He just kept drifting further and further away. I think the worst thing that ever happened to him was drugs." It's a sad, sad story. Sad indeed, because this once bright kid turned heroin and crack fiend was about to cozy up to doing very, very bad things, as the body of headless young women would prove, among other terrible crimes he committed. To know when all this violence started, we can look to Metheney's long confessional pieces of writing. He said that July 1994 was when he finally lost the plot. Sure, he was known before that as a heavy-drinking, drug-talking man who liked to hang around some of the meanest streets, but those that knew him ironically as Tiny said he was always friendly and polite. That July, something snapped in him. He got home one day to find his wife and son gone. She'd taken away anything of value from the house and vanished. This is how Metheney described it. "I was a truck driver. I was working overtime this one night. Then I got off and went home as I always did. But when I opened the door and turned on the light, I noticed there was nothing there." He said he didn't care much that she was missing since, like him, her main focus in life revolved around little hard white rocks that provided a temporary feeling of euphoria. What drove him mad was the fact that she'd taken his kid with her. Metheney says 6 months later she was busted for drugs along with the man that had become her pimp. The child was subsequently moved into care and his wife and her pimp were back out on the streets. Metheney explained, "I took it upon myself, with the hatred I had for these two who lost my son, to go looking for them. I'd found out from someone that they were going under that bridge and getting high with some homeless." The place he mentioned was actually a home to a kind of tent city underneath Baltimore's Hanover Street Bridge. There, he didn't find his wife, but he did see 2 men that, in his own words, were passed out on some stinking mattress. They were Randall Brewer and Randy Piker, and they both died after Metheney bludgeoned them with an axe. That same night, he says he lured a woman down to the same spot on the promise of some free drugs. He said in exchange for information about his missing wife, she could get high on his account, except she was not forthcoming with any information. For that, Metheney killed her. Not long after, he lured another vulnerable drug addict down to the bridge and killed her too. The bodies were mounting up, and then another person became the victim of Metheney's rage. Just as he was trying to dispose of the 2 women's bodies, he noticed that a man who was fishing had spotted him. Metheney let go of the body, picked up a steel pipe, and raced down toward the man. Metheney explained how it went after that. "That was a very busy night for me. 5 murders within about 7 hours. I washed up in that river, cleaned up the crime scene as much as I could, and then left. 2.5 weeks later, I was arrested and charged with the murders of the 2 men I chopped up." You're probably wondering now how this extremely violent man managed to make people into burgers after being arrested for murder. The plain answer is after spending 18 months in Baltimore City Jail, the case was thrown out of court because of lack of evidence. Once a free man, he got his old job back as a forklift driver at Joe Stein & Son Pallet Company. His boss was kind enough to let him live on the premises in a trailer. And that's where some terrible things happened. On the promise that he'd ensure no one broke into the factory, his boss handed him the keys. In Metheney's own words, the company was on a dead-end road and was very isolated. It was perfect for what I wanted to do. What he wanted to do was kill again. If the first murder spree had happened out of some kind of blind rage, now he wanted to do it because he discovered he'd enjoyed it. He admitted as much in court, saying, "I got a rush out of it. I got a high out of it. Call it what you want. I had no real excuse why other than I'd like to do it." Now we'll explain how his addiction to killing evolved. In the year 1995, a 23-year-old woman named Kimberly Spicer could be seen on a video taken by her sister when the two were visiting their father in a hospital prior to him having surgery. The sister asks Kim what she's doing since she looks to be in some sort of trance. Kim responds, "I'm looking out the harbor window wishing I was on the boat." Her dream of sailing away was likely due to the fact that she was addicted to crack cocaine. That's why, not long after that video was taken, she walked into the world of the man who was going to take her life. It's likely she met Metheney in a bar, the kind of place where he spent his $7 an hour when he wasn't out buying drugs. It was there that the predator scoured the faces of women looking for the most vulnerable. Thing was, no one expected him to be a killer. Kim had an older sister who worked in one of the bars where Metheney frequented. This sister once said nobody would have thought it. He was so mannerly, saying thank you and please all the time. My sister once even said she felt sorry for him. That was her fatal mistake, because one night she ended up in his trailer, and that was the last night of her life. Her body was later discovered buried not far from the trailer. This plot, if you can call it that, wasn't far away from the buried body of a prostitute that Metheney had murdered much earlier. That was the body of Kathy Ann Magaziner, a woman who Metheney killed, buried, but then for some warped reason exhumed her body to remove the head. He later said in court, "I just took the head and threw it in a box in the trash." He also later admitted to chopping up the bodies and storing some of the meat in Tupperware bowls, which he then put in a freezer. That's when he got the idea to start a meat stand on the weekends, and he'd offer burgers to passerbys and the occasional trucker. Again, you need to hear this from the horse's mouth. Metheney said, "I had a real roast beef and pork sandwich, and why not? They were very good. The human body taste is very similar to pork. If you mix it together, no one can tell the difference." He said everything was going great, explaining that the sandwiches, which people told him had a peculiar but amazing taste, were selling really well. Thing was, he ran out of his special meat. He went out once again to the streets looking for prey. He found what he was looking for when he met a young woman named Rita Kemper. She was happy to go back to his trailer and share his drugs, but when his giant frame got too close to her, she made a run for it. As you know, this trailer was in a dark place pretty much out of sight of everything, and although Kemper managed to get a certain distance away, he caught up with her and beat her. He dragged her kicking and screaming back to the trailer. Once there, he looked at her menacingly and said, "I'm gonna kill you and bury you in the woods with the other girls." He later admitted that it was after a momentary lapse of concentration that she escaped again, this time managing to find a way out of the nightmarish factory grounds. Metheney explained in detail how this happened. There was an 8-foot chain-link fence with barbed wire on top of it around the front of the company. There was a stack of wooden pallets next to the fence about 10 feet high. He said she scaled those pallets like a monkey and then jumped the fence and ran down to the main road where some guy in a pickup truck picked her up and took her to a nearby gas station where they called the cops. He knew now that he was done. Metheney said he gathered all of Kemper's clothes and calmly walked to the gates that he'd earlier locked to prevent her from getting out. Just then a cop pulled up at a car. A man got out and pointed a gun at Metheney. In his own words, that's where it all came to an end. What Metheney failed to mention in his own story was what he said to the cop. This was Baltimore City Police Officer Timothy Utzig, who explained in court how their interaction went. As soon as Metheney was cuffed and in the back of the car, he looked at Utzig and said, "You don't have to be scared." Utzig, surprised seeing as Metheney was in handcuffs, said, "Don't worry, Val, I'm not scared." Metheney replied, "You ought to be." Kemper told the police that Metheney had told her he was going to kill her and bury her next to his trailer just as he'd done with the other two women. Sure enough, the police soon found the bodies, including one with a missing skull. Metheney told police that he'd killed more women and was indicted but not convicted for one of those confessions. It's likely in total he murdered 10 women, most of them drug addicts, the homeless, or prostitutes. Police just didn't have the evidence to convict him of any more murders, even though chances were he was telling the truth. Unfortunately, sometimes when the poorest and most vulnerable in society go missing, what some academics have called the less dead people, investigations are often lax or hardly even started. Less dead people are often not reported missing. The jury is still out as to if he really did kill that many people. His attorney, Margaret A. Mead, who once said he was kind and gentle when he spoke to her, thinks he likely did. She said in an interview, "I have no reason not to believe him. I've always found him to be forthright and honest. I think he's telling the truth. Metheney was sentenced to death in 1998, aged 43. That sentence was later overturned because of a technicality, and he was given life without the chance of parole. While incarcerated at the Western Correctional Institution, he was found dead in his jail cell just short of 20 years into his sentence. During his imprisonment, he'd put pen to paper many times, once offering the stark warning: next time you're riding down the road and you happen to see an open pit beef stand that you've never seen before, make sure you think about this story before you take a bite out of that sandwich. Sometimes you never know who you may be eating. Ha ha. Now you need to watch a brutal true story of what they didn't tell you about the Burger Chef massacre. Or have a look at My Nice Neighbor, Serial Killer, True Crime.